The millionaire disguised himself as a homeless man for a day and met a woman who would change his life forever, showing him the true meaning of love. The mirror didn't lie. Alexander Roth, one of the richest men in New York, barely recognized the figure staring back at him. His designer clothes had been replaced by worn and dirty rags. An unshaven beard and unkempt hair completed the transformation. He adjusted the battered cap on his head, covering the grey hairs that showed his 45 years. "Are you ready, Mr. Roth?" asked James, his personal assistant, with a mixture of concern and skepticism in his voice. Alexander nodded, his blue eyes shining with determination. "More than ready, James. It's time to see the world through different eyes." The plan was simple, yet unusual. To spend 24 hours living as a homeless man on the streets of Manhattan, for someone used to luxury and comfort, it was an idea that bordered on madness. But Alexander was determined to understand a reality that he had always seen from a distance, protected by the windows of his limousine or from the top of his penthouse office. "Remember, sir," James continued, "the tracking device is active. Any emergency, just press the panic button." Alexander laughed, a sound that echoed strangely in his own ears. "Relax, James. I'm not going into a war zone." But as he rode down the service elevator of the luxurious building where he lived, Alexander felt the first chill in his stomach. The door opened onto a Manhattan he had never really known, noisy, hectic, and, in a way, threatening. His first steps were hesitant. People passed him without a second glance, as if he were invisible. It was a strange sensation for someone used to being the center of attention in any environment he frequented. Hours passed, and the reality of life on the streets began to take its toll. The autumn chill seeped through his thin clothes, and hunger gripped his stomach. Alexander found himself wandering aimlessly, observing the city he thought he knew so well from a new perspective. That's when he saw her for the first time. She was sitting on the sidewalk near the entrance to a subway station. Her brown hair was tied up in a messy bun, and her clothes, although worn, looked clean. What caught Alexander's eye, however, was the kind smile she offered to every person she passed, regardless of whether they received anything in return or not. Intrigued, Alexander approached. The woman raised her eyes, and he was immediately captured by a gaze that radiated a kindness he had rarely encountered in his privileged life. "Hello," she said, her voice surprisingly melodious. "You look new here. Is everything all right?" Alexander hesitated, momentarily speechless. Here he was, a billionaire in disguise, being approached with genuine concern by someone who clearly had so little. Yes, I'm new here," he stammered, surprised at his own lack of eloquence. "My name is Alex." "Nice to meet you, Alex. I'm Grace," she replied, the smile never leaving her lips. "Have you eaten today?" Before Alexander could answer, his stomach rumbled audibly, eliciting a soft laugh from Grace. She held out her hand, offering half a sandwich wrapped carefully in a napkin. "It's not much, but it's fresh. The bakery around the corner always donates what's left at the end of the day." Alexander stood paralyzed, staring at the sandwich as if it were something alien. In all his years of life, no one had ever shared food with him like this, with such simplicity and generosity. "I can't accept it," he muttered, feeling suddenly ashamed. "You need it more than I do." Grace shook her head, her smile widening. "No one needs to go hungry alone, Alex. Besides, sharing makes everything tastier." Reluctantly, Alexander accepted the sandwich. As he took the first bite, he realized that he was starving. The simple taste of the bread and cheese seemed more delicious than any gourmet meal he had ever tasted. As they ate in comfortable silence, Alexander watched Grace out of the corner of his eye. There was a dignity in her posture, a light in her eyes that defied the circumstances in which she found herself. "How long have you been here?" he asked hesitantly, not wanting to offend her. Grace shrugged, her gaze wandering down the busy street. "Almost 2 years now. I lost my job, then my apartment. It's a common story around here." Alexander felt a pang of guilt. How many times had he passed people like Grace without even noticing them? "And you never thought about giving up?" The words came out before he could stop them. Grace's gaze turned to him, intense and penetrating. Giving up is never an option, Alex. Every day is a new opportunity to change our situation. Besides, she gestured broadly with her hand, there's so much good in the world, even in the most unlikely places. Alexander felt something change inside him. Here was a woman who had lost everything, but still held on to hope and compassion. It was a lesson in humility that hit him with the force of a train. The next few hours passed like a blur. Grace introduced him to other homeless people, shared stories of the small acts of kindness she witnessed on a daily basis, and showed Alexander a side of New York he had never imagined existed. When night fell, Grace took him to a shelter where they could spend the night. In the queue to get in, Alexander noticed how she greeted each person by name, offering words of encouragement or simply a smile. "How do you do that?" he asked, amazed. "How do you keep that light, despite everything?" Grace looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Because each person deserves to be seen, Alex. Each of us carries a story, dreams, and value. Sometimes, all someone needs is to be reminded of that." At that moment, lying on a thin mattress in a crowded shelter, Alexander Roth, the billionaire, the business tycoon, the man who thought he had everything, realized that he was facing the richest person he had ever met. And as sleep enveloped him, a certainty formed in his mind. His life would never be the same after this day. Grace had planted a seed of change in his heart, and he was determined to see it flourish. What Alexander didn't know was that the real challenge and the real transformation were yet to come. Dawn in New York came with the familiar buzz of the city waking up. For Alexander Roth, however, the awakening was anything but familiar. The hard floor under his back, the muggy air of the crowded shelter, and the sound of breathing and movement around him jolted him out of sleep. For a moment, he was disoriented, his eyes scanning the strange surroundings. Then memories of the previous day flooded his mind. The disguise, the streets of Manhattan seen from a totally new perspective, and Grace, especially Grace. Alexander sat down, running his hand over his rough, unshaven face. His gaze wandered around the room, looking for the woman who had changed his life in less than 24 hours. She was nowhere in sight. A knot formed in his stomach. What if it was all just a dream? What if Grace was just a figment of his imagination, a personification of everything he secretly wanted to be? "Good morning, Alex," a familiar voice surprised him. "Did you sleep well?" Alexander turned to find Grace smiling at him, her eyes shining with the same kindness that had captivated him the day before. Relief flooded him, followed immediately by a wave of guilt. How could he have doubted her existence, even for a moment? "As well as can be expected, I guess," he replied, trying to mask his discomfort with a smile. "And you?" Grace shrugged, still smiling. "Every day we wake up is a blessing, isn't it? Come on, breakfast is being served. We'd better hurry if we want something hot." As they made their way to the breakfast line, Alexander couldn't help but notice how Grace greeted each person by name, offering words of encouragement or simply a warm smile. It was as if she carried with her a light of her own, illuminating the darkest corners of the place. With trays of porridge and coffee in hand, they found a quiet corner to sit in. Alexander watched, fascinated, as Grace interacted with the people around her. She seemed to know everyone's story, their struggles and their dreams. "How do you do it?" he finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. "How do you manage to maintain this positivity, this connection with everyone?" Grace looked at him for a long moment before answering, her eyes penetrating deep into his. "You know, Alex, when you lose everything, you discover that the only thing that really matters are the connections we make. Each person here has a story, has value. Sometimes, all they need is someone to see them, to listen to them." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat. In all his life of privilege, he had never really seen the people around him. Employees, business partners, even family members, they were all pieces in a big corporate chess game. But it must be exhausting, he argued, more to himself than to Grace. Carrying the burden of so many stories, so many struggles. Grace smiled, a smile that seemed to light up her whole face. "It's not a burden, Alex. It's a privilege. Every story I hear, every smile I manage to provoke, reminds me that there is still good in the world, and that it gives me the strength to carry on." Grace's words hit Alexander like a punch in the gut. Here he was, a man who had everything in material terms, feeling empty and purposeless, and here was Grace, who had nothing but the clothes on her body, radiating a wealth of spirit that he could barely comprehend. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of activity. Grace guided him through the streets of Manhattan, showing him the little oases of kindness hidden in the concrete jungle, a bakery that donated loaves of bread at the end of the day, a hairdresser that offered free haircuts once a month, a library that opened its doors to anyone who needed a warm place to stay. It was during one of these stops, sitting on a park bench sharing a sandwich, that Alexander finally plucked up the courage to ask the question that had been plaguing him since the day before. "Grace," he began, hesitantly, How did you end up on the streets?" Grace's smile faltered for a moment, a shadow passing across her eyes. Alexander immediately regretted the question, fearing he had crossed some invisible boundary. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked. It's too personal, "No, it's okay," Grace interrupted him gently. "It's a valid question, and maybe it's time to share my story." She took a deep breath, her gaze straying into the distance. "I haven't always lived like this, you know. 3 years ago, I had a life that many would consider enviable. I was an executive in a big company, I had a beautiful apartment, designer clothes, the whole package." Alexander listened, fascinated. Grace's story seemed like a distorted reflection of his own life. Then, in a single week, everything fell apart, she continued. "My company went bankrupt in a corruption scandal. I wasn't involved, but my reputation was ruined. In the same period, I was diagnosed with cancer." Grace paused, and Alexander realized she was holding her breath. Suddenly, all those friends I thought I had disappeared. The money I had saved was quickly eaten up with treatment. And before I knew it, well, here I am. "But how?" Alexander stammered, struggling to find the right words. "How could you not be bitter about it all?" Grace turned to him, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and determination. "Oh, I got bitter, Alex. For a while, I was furious with the world, with God, with everything and everyone. But do you know what saved me?" Alexander shook his head, unable to speak. "Kindness. The kindness of strangers. People who had no obligation to help me, but did so anyway. That's what made me realize that, no matter how bad things get, there's always light if you're willing to see it." Grace's words echoed in Alexander's mind. All his life, he had operated under the belief that the world was a cold and unforgiving place, where only the strongest survived. And here was this woman who had lost everything, teaching him about the strength of compassion and kindness. "Grace, he began, feeling a sudden need to confess, to reveal who he really was. But before he could continue, a scream cut through the air. "Help! Someone call an ambulance!" Grace jumped to her feet, her eyes scanning the park. Alexander followed her, his heart racing. A few meters away, an elderly man was lying on the ground, surrounded by a small crowd of stunned onlookers. Without hesitation, Grace ran towards the man, Alexander right behind her. As they approached, he could see the old man's pale face, his eyes closed tightly. "Give me some room, please," Grace commanded, her voice firm and authoritative. The crowd stepped back, making way for her. Alexander watched in amazement as Grace took control of the situation. She checked the man's vital signs, started CPR when she realized he wasn't breathing, and gave clear instructions for someone to call an ambulance. Minutes that seemed like hours passed before the sound of sirens filled the air. The paramedics arrived, taking over the elderly man's care. Grace stepped back, her hands shaking slightly. Where did you learn to do that?" Alexander asked, still in shock at what he had just witnessed. Grace smiled weakly. "Corporate first aid training. I never thought I'd use it outside the boardroom. But, well, life's full of surprises, isn't it?" As they watched the ambulance leave, Alexander felt something change inside him. The admiration he felt for Grace turned into something deeper, more meaningful. He realized that he was facing someone truly extraordinary. And at that moment, Alexander Roth, the billionaire disguised as a homeless man, made a decision. He was going to change, not just for a day or a week, but forever. Grace had shown him a world of possibilities he had never considered, a world where true wealth was not measured in dollars, but in human connections and acts of kindness. But first, he needed to be honest, with Grace and with himself. "Grace," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you." The sun was beginning to set over Manhattan, casting long shadows across the skyscrapers. And as the city prepared for night, two hearts prepared for a conversation that would change their lives forever. Dusk painted the New York sky in shades of orange and pink as Alexander and Grace walked side by side through the bustling streets of Manhattan. The silence between them was palpable, heavy with the weight of Alexander's unspoken words. "Grace," he began again, his voice trembling slightly, "there's something I need to tell you, something important." Grace stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "What is it, Alex? You can tell me anything." Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his farce pressing down on his chest. "I'm not who you think I am. In fact, I am—" Just then, a group of well-dressed executives walked past them, laughing loudly and discussing the stock market. One of them bumped into Alexander, causing him to stumble. "Hey, watch where you're going, bum!" the man shouted over his shoulder without even stopping. Grace immediately stepped forward, as if to protect Alexander. "Don't mind them, Alex. Some people just can't see past appearances." The irony of the situation didn't escape Alexander. Here he was, about to reveal his true identity, and the universe seemed to be mocking him. "That's what I want to talk about, Grace," he said, gathering his courage. "I'm not really homeless. In fact, I'm—" "Alexander Roth," a familiar voice interrupted him. Alexander turned sharply, his heart racing. There, a few meters away, was James, his personal assistant, with an expression of relief and concern on his face. "Mr. Roth, thank God I found you," James said, approaching quickly. "We've been looking for you for hours. The council is panicking, thinking something terrible has happened." Grace looked from James to Alexander, confusion evident on her face. "Alex? What's going on? Who is this man?" Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his actions crashing down on him. When he opened them again, he met Grace's gaze. "I'm sorry, Grace. I should have told you before. My real name is Alexander Roth. I'm an entrepreneur. In fact, I'm the CEO of Roth Industries." The shock on Grace's face was palpable. She took a step back, as if she had been physically struck by Alexander's words. You lied to me. All this time." The pain in his voice was evident. "No. I mean, yes, but not in the way you think," Alexander tried to explain, the words coming out hastily. "I wanted to understand. I wanted to see the world from a different perspective. I never imagined I'd meet someone like you." Grace shook her head, tears shining in her eyes. "I shared my life with you, Alex. Or should I say, Mr. Roth. I trusted you, and all this time, it was just an experiment for you." "No, Grace, please," Alexander begged, taking a step towards her. But Grace stepped back, holding up a hand to keep him at bay. I need some time to process this," she said, her voice shaking. Without another word, she turned and began to walk away quickly. "Grace, wait." Alexander tried to follow her, but James grabbed him by the arm. "Mr. Roth, please. We have an urgent situation in the office that requires your immediate attention." Alexander watched helplessly as Grace's figure disappeared into the crowd. He felt as if a part of him was being torn away, leaving a painful void in his chest. "James," he finally said, his voice hoarse with emotion. "Get the car ready. We're going to the office." The drive back to Roth Industries was a blur for Alexander. His mind was filled with images of Grace, her gentle smile, her eyes full of compassion, the pain on her face when the truth came out. When they arrived at the imposing skyscraper that housed the company's headquarters, Alexander barely recognized his reflection in the elevator mirror. Still dressed in the threadbare clothes of his disguise, he looked like an intruder in his own domain. The meeting room was packed when he entered. Senior executives, lawyers and board members, all with expressions of concern and relief at seeing him. "Alexander, where the hell have you been?" roared Richard Blackwell, the chairman of the board. "We have a crisis on our hands and you just disappear for 2 days." Alexander looked at the anxious faces around him, feeling a sudden wave of nausea. How could he explain the transformation he had undergone? How could he make them understand what Grace had taught him in just 48 hours? I needed a different perspective," he began, his voice gaining strength as he spoke, "and what I've discovered is going to change everything." For 2 hours, Alexander spoke. He shared his experience on the streets, the people he met, the stories he heard. He talked about Grace, about her strength, her compassion, her ability to see the best in people, even in the worst of circumstances. And then, to the shock of everyone present, Alexander presented a plan to transform Roth Industries from a mere corporation into a force for good. Social housing programs, training initiatives for homeless people, partnerships with charitable organizations. "But that will cost millions," protested one of the executives. "The shareholders will never approve that." Alexander stood up, his posture exuding a determination that few had seen before. "Then we'll find new shareholders," he declared. "Those who understand that the true value of a company is not just in its profits, but in the positive impact it can have on the world." The room erupted into heated discussions. Some enthusiastically supported Alexander's vision, others vehemently rejected it. But Alexander barely listened to them. His mind was focused on just one thing: finding Grace and making things right. When he finally managed to escape the meeting, it was after midnight. Exhausted but determined, Alexander made his way to his private office. As he entered, he was greeted by James, who was waiting for him with a grave expression. "Mr. Roth, there's something I need to show you," said James, handing him a folder. Alexander opened the folder and felt his heart sink. It was a detailed report on Grace, her past, her previous career, even medical records. "James, what's this? Why did you investigate Grace?" Alexander asked, his voice shaking with anger and disappointment. "It's standard procedure, sir," James replied calmly. "Whenever someone new comes into close contact with you, we do a background check. It's for your own safety." Alexander flipped through the report, his mind spinning with the information. Grace had told the truth about everything: her previous career, her cancer diagnosis, the company's bankruptcy. But there was more, much more. "Sir," James continued hesitantly, "there's something else you need to know about Grace." Alexander looked up from the report, his heart racing. "What? What else could there be?" James took a deep breath before answering. "Grace, she's not just an ex-executive who's fallen on hard times. She's your half-sister." Alexander's world seemed to stop. James' words echoed in his ears, but he could barely understand them. Grace, his half-sister. How was that possible? "Explain," he managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. James nodded, pulling some more documents out of his briefcase. "Your father. Well, it seems he had an affair many years ago. Grace is the result of that relationship. She never knew the truth about her biological father, and apparently neither did her father know about her." Alexander sank into his chair, feeling as if the floor had been ripped out from under his feet. Everything he thought he knew about his life, his family, seemed to be crumbling around him. "She doesn't know," he muttered, more to himself than to James. "Grace has no idea who I really am, who she really is." James hesitated before speaking again. "Mr. Roth, what do you intend to do with this information?" Alexander was silent for a long moment, his gaze lost in the night view of Manhattan through his office window. Finally, he stood up, a new determination shining in his eyes. "Find her, James," he ordered. "Find Grace. We need to talk." As James hurried off to carry out his order, Alexander turned to the window, watching the lights of the city that never sleeps. Somewhere out there was Grace, his newfound sister, the woman who had changed his life in just 2 days. Alexander knew that the road ahead would be difficult. There were painful truths to be revealed, trust to be rebuilt, and a new future to be forged. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, truly motivated by something greater than profits and power. With Grace, he had discovered the true meaning of family, of compassion, of making a difference in the world. And now, armed with the truth and a new vision for his life and his company, Alexander was determined to make things right, not just for Grace, but for all those who, like her, needed a second chance. The sun was rising over New York, marking the beginning of a new day. For Alexander Roth, it was the start of a new life. A life that, he hoped, would include Grace not just as an inspiration, but as family. The morning sun had barely begun to touch Manhattan's skyscrapers when Alexander Roth hurried out of his office's private elevator. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he seemed to have returned to his old life, but his eyes told a different story. There was a mixture of determination and vulnerability in them that his associates had rarely seen. "Any news, James?" he asked as soon as he spotted his assistant. James shook his head, frustration evident in his expression. "Not yet, Mr. Roth. Our teams are scouring all the shelters and known locations where homeless people usually congregate, but so far no sign of Grace." Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of guilt and worry. Grace had been missing for almost 24 hours from the moment he discovered the truth about her identity. And now, knowing that she was his half-sister, the urgency to find her was even greater. "Keep looking," he ordered. "Use all the resources necessary. I need to find her." While James left to coordinate the search, Alexander found himself alone in his vast office. The contrast between the luxury that surrounded him and the life he had experienced on the streets over the last few days was stark. Every expensive object, every piece of art seemed to mock him, reminding him of the gulf that existed between his world and Grace's. He was unable to concentrate on his work. Alexander decided to do something he hadn't done for years: go for a walk. Not in an exclusive park or on a fancy street, but on the same streets where he had met Grace for the first time. As he left the Roth Industries building, ignoring the surprised stares of the employees, Alexander mingled with the crowd of hurrying New Yorkers. This time, dressed in his expensive suit, he was visible. Too much so. People recognized him. Some waved, others whispered among themselves, but Alexander hardly noticed. His eyes searched every face, every corner, hoping to see Grace's gentle smile. With every homeless person he saw, his heart leapt, only to sink again when he realized it wasn't her. After hours of aimless walking, Alexander found himself back in the park where Grace had saved the old man's life. He sat on the same bench where they had shared a sandwich and talked about life. The memory was so vivid that he could almost feel her presence beside him. "Oh, Grace," he murmured to himself. "Where are you? What have I done?" "Talking to yourself, boss," a familiar voice surprised him. Alexander turned quickly to find Olivia Chen, the bright young director of social responsibility at Roth Industries, standing next to him. Olivia was known for her passion for social causes and for constantly challenging the status quo within the company. "Olivia," Alexander said, trying to pull his expression together. "What are you doing here?" She shrugged, taking a seat next to him on the bench. "I heard rumors that the great Alexander Roth was wandering the streets like a common man. I had to see for myself." Alexander couldn't help but smile slightly. Olivia had always been direct, a quality he admired even when it irritated him. "And what do you think?" he asked, genuinely curious. Olivia studied him for a moment before answering. "I think something's changed. You're different, Alex. More human." Olivia's words hit Alexander like a punch in the gut. Human. That's exactly how he felt. Vulnerable, confused, full of emotions he could barely name. "Olivia," he began, hesitantly, If you had the chance to do something really significant, something that could change lives, but perhaps shake everything you've built, Would you do it? Olivia raised an eyebrow, puzzled. That sounds like the kind of question I normally ask you, not the other way around. Alexander laughed humorlessly. Things have changed more than you realize. For a moment, they were both silent, watching the people passing through the park. Finally, Olivia spoke. You know, Alex, ever since I started working at Roth Industries, I've dreamed of the day when we could use our resources to make a real difference. Not just charitable donations to improve our image, but real, structural change. She turned to face him, her eyes shining with passion. If you're considering something like this, count me in. Whatever has happened to you over the last few days, it seems to have opened your eyes to what really matters. Olivia's words ignited a spark of hope in Alexander's chest. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone on this journey. Thank you, Olivia, he said, his voice heavy with emotion. I think I'm going to need your help more than ever in the coming days. As they talked, working out ideas and possibilities, Alexander's phone rang. It was James. Mr. Roth. James' voice sounded urgent. We found Grace. Alexander's heart raced. Where? Is she all right? There was a pause on the other end of the line before James answered. She's at Mount Sinai Hospital. Sir, she's had a relapse. The cancer. Alexander didn't wait to hear the rest. Standing up abruptly, he turned to Olivia. I have to go. There's someone very important who needs me. Olivia nodded, understanding. Go, and Alex, remember, you're not alone in this. With a final nod of thanks, Alexander ran towards the street, shouting for a cab. As the vehicle snaked through New York traffic, his mind was in turmoil. Grace, his newfound sister, was ill. The cancer she had mentioned. How could he have been so blind, so absorbed in his own transformation, that he didn't realize how serious her situation was? Arriving at the hospital, Alexander barely waited for the elevator, climbing the stairs every 2 steps. When he finally reached the indicated floor, he saw her. Grace was lying in a hospital bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets. Her eyes were closed, and a series of tubes and machines surrounded her. For a moment, Alexander stood paralyzed in the doorway, fear and guilt threatening to engulf him. Then Grace opened her eyes, her gaze meeting his. For an instant, there was a flash of recognition, followed by confusion, and then something else. Something Alexander couldn't decipher. Slowly, he approached the bed, his heart beating so loudly that he was sure Grace could hear him. Hi, he said softly, his voice trembling. Grace watched him for a long moment before answering. You came, she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Of course I came, Alexander replied, feeling tears burn his eyes. Grace, there's so much I need to tell you, so many things you need to know. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength. When she opened them again, there was a familiar determination in them, the same strength that had captivated Alexander from the start. So tell me, Grace said, because I have a feeling that time may be shorter than we'd like. Alexander pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down, and took Grace's hand in his. And then, with a heavy heart but full of hope, he began to talk about his father, about the past they shared without knowing it, about the plans he was making to change his company and his life. As the words flowed, Alexander felt as if a weight was being lifted from his shoulders. Grace listened in silence, her face a mixture of emotions, shock, sadness, and something that could be forgiveness. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Finally, Grace squeezed Alexander's hand lightly. You know, she said, a small smile playing on her lips, I always wanted a brother. The words, so simple and yet so profound, broke something inside Alexander. The tears he had held back for so long finally fell, and he leaned in, hugging Grace gently, careful of the tubes and wires. I promise, he whispered, that I will do everything in my power to help you, to make things right, not just for you, but for everyone who needs a second chance. Grace pulled away slightly, looking into Alexander's eyes. Don't make promises you can't keep, Alex. Life is unpredictable. You know that now. Alexander nodded, wiping away the tears. You're right, but I can promise you this. I'll try. Every day, I'll try to be better, to do better. And I want you to be there with me, guiding me, challenging me. A genuine smile lit up Grace's face. That, she said, is a promise I can accept. As the afternoon sun cast a golden glow through the hospital window, brother and sister, united by fate and separated by circumstance, began to plan for a future that neither of them could have imagined just a few days earlier. Alexander knew that the road ahead would be difficult. Grace's treatment, the transformation of his company, the fight against society's expectations and prejudices, all were monumental challenges. But for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive, truly motivated by something bigger than himself. With Grace by his side, even from a hospital bed, Alexander was ready to face whatever the future held, because now he understood the true meaning of wealth, of family, and of making a difference in the world. And as night fell over New York, two souls, once lost and now found, began to dream of a better tomorrow, not just for them, but for all those who, like Grace, needed an outstretched hand and an open heart. The days following Alexander and Grace's reunion at the hospital were a whirlwind of emotions, decisions, and changes. Grace's hospital room became the unlikely epicenter of a silent revolution that was about to shake the foundations of Roth Industries and, perhaps, all of New York. Alexander divided his time between the office and the hospital, often conducting meetings via video conference from the small sofa in Grace's room. She watched, fascinated and sometimes amused, as her newfound brother navigated the complex worlds of business and philanthropy with a passion she had never imagined seeing in him. "Do you really think you can make this work?" Grace asked one afternoon, after Alexander had ended a particularly tense call with the company's board. Alexander smiled, tired but determined. "I don't have a choice, do I? You showed me a world I could no longer ignore. Now it's my responsibility to use the resources I have to make a difference." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "You know, when I was an executive, I always dreamed of using corporate power for good, but there always seemed to be obstacles, excuses, reasons not to act." "And now?" Alexander asked, curious. "Now," Grace laughed softly. "Now I have a brother stubborn enough to knock down those obstacles." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Olivia Chen, who entered the room carrying a stack of folders and a laptop. "Sorry I'm late," she said, placing the materials on the small dining table. "Traffic was a nightmare." "Oh, hello, Grace. Are you feeling better today?" Grace smiled at the young executive. Over the last few days, she had become a constant presence, bringing not only innovative ideas, but also a contagious energy that lit up the hospital room. "One day at a time, Olivia, but having you two here, planning to change the world, is the best medicine I could ask for." Alexander observed the interaction between the two women with a mixture of gratitude and admiration. Grace, even in her fragile condition, emanated a strength that inspired everyone around her. And Olivia, with her passion and determination, was proving to be an invaluable ally in the mission to transform Roth Industries. "So, what do we have for today?" Alexander asked, turning his attention to the documents Olivia had brought. "Well," Olivia began, opening her laptop, "I spent the evening reviewing our options for the social housing program. I think I found a way to restructure some of our real estate investments to create affordable housing without significantly compromising our profits." Alexander nodded, impressed. "That's excellent, Olivia. The board will be more receptive if we can show that it's possible to do good and still keep the company profitable. But that's not all," Olivia continued, her enthusiasm growing. "I've also drawn up a plan for partnerships with local organizations that support homeless people. We can offer not only housing, but also training programs, medical care, and psychological support." Grace leaned forward on her bed, her eyes shining with interest. "That's amazing, Olivia. It's exactly the kind of holistic approach that can really make a difference to people's lives." Alexander smiled, feeling a surge of pride. "Did you see that, Grace?" I told you we were putting together quite a team. The next few hours were filled with lively discussions, strategic planning, and occasional moments of laughter. It was a surreal scenario: a billionaire, a recovering ex-executive, and a young corporate visionary, all gathered in a hospital room, drawing up plans to change the world. As the afternoon progressed, Alexander noticed that Grace looked tired. "I think it's time we took a break," he said gently. "You need to rest, little sister." Grace rolled her eyes when she heard the nickname, but didn't protest. The truth was that, despite her determination, the chemotherapy sessions were taking their toll. While Olivia packed up her belongings, promising to return the next day with more updates, Alexander helped Grace settle into bed. "Alex," Grace said softly, taking his hand. "You know I can't promise I'll be here to see all these plans come to fruition, right?" Alexander felt his heart squeeze. "Don't talk like that, Grace. You'll be fine. You have to." Grace smiled sadly. "Life doesn't work on the basis of have to, big brother. But I want you to promise me something." "Anything," Alexander replied without hesitation. "Promise me that, no matter what happens to me, you will continue with these plans. That you'll use your power and resources to make the difference you always knew you could make." Alexander swallowed, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. "I promise, Grace. But you're going to be here to help me keep that promise. Understand?" Grace nodded, her eyes slowly closing. "I understand. Now go, CEO. You have an empire to transform." Alexander kissed his sister's forehead before quietly leaving the room. In the hallway, he found Olivia waiting for him. "She'll be fine, Alex," Olivia said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. Alexander nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Finally, he pulled himself together. "Come on, Olivia. We've got a lot of work to do." In the weeks that followed, Roth Industries underwent an unprecedented transformation. Alexander, driven by his promise to Grace and supported by Olivia's expertise, implemented radical changes to the company's structure and priorities. The social housing program was launched with great fanfare, converting several Roth real estate developments into affordable housing. Partnerships were established with local organizations, creating a support network for people in vulnerable situations. But the most significant change came in the form of a new division of the company, the Roth Foundation. Dedicated exclusively to social and environmental initiatives, the foundation quickly became a model of how corporate power could be used for the common good. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There was resistance from conservative shareholders, criticism from the media who questioned the true intentions behind the changes, and countless logistical challenges. But with each obstacle, Alexander remembered Grace's smile, her strength in the face of adversity, and found the courage to keep going. Grace, for her part, continued her battle against cancer with the same determination that had inspired her brother. On good days, she took an active part in discussions and planning. On the bad days, her mere presence was a constant reminder of why they were doing it all. One afternoon, about 2 months into their journey of transformation, Alexander walked into Grace's room with a beaming smile on his face. "We did it, Grace," he exclaimed, barely containing his excitement. "The first group of families are moving into their new homes today. And you won't believe it, but we've managed to partner with 3 of the biggest hospitals in the city to provide free care for the residents." Grace smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and excitement. "This is wonderful, Alex. You're really making it happen." Alexander sat on the edge of the bed, holding his sister's hand. "We're making it happen, Grace. None of this would be possible without you." For a moment, they were both silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they had accomplished in such a short time. "You know," Grace finally said, "when I was on the streets, I often wondered if things would ever change. If someone with power and resources would really care enough to make a difference." She paused, squeezing Alexander's hand. "I never imagined that someone would be my brother." Alexander felt tears fill his eyes, "and I never imagined that I would find my sister and my purpose at the same time." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted the conversation. It was Dr. Patel, Grace's oncologist. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, entering the room with a cautious smile, "but I have some news you'll want to hear." Alexander and Grace exchanged apprehensive glances. They had been waiting for this moment, dreading and looking forward to it in equal measure. Dr. Patel approached, holding a set of tests. "The latest test results are in, and, well, I don't want to give you false hope, but we're seeing a very positive response to the treatment. The tumor has shrunk significantly." The news hit the siblings like a wave. Grace covered her mouth with her hands, tears of relief and joy streaming down her face. Alexander, for his part, was momentarily speechless, the emotion completely overwhelming him. Does that mean?" Grace finally managed to ask. Dr. Patel smiled gently. "It means that we have reason to be optimistic. The road is still long, but we're heading in the right direction." When the doctor left, leaving the siblings to process the news, Alexander and Grace hugged each other, their tears welling up. "Did you see that?" Alexander whispered. "I told you that you'd be here to see our plans come to fruition." Grace laughed through her tears. "Looks like the universe has plans for both of us, big brother." That night, as New York sparkled outside, two siblings, united by fate, blood, and a shared purpose, made plans for a future that, for the first time in a long time, seemed bright and full of possibilities. Alexander and Grace's journey was far from over. There were still many challenges ahead, both personal and professional, but now more than ever, they knew that together they were capable of overcoming any obstacle and making the difference that the world so desperately needed. And so, in the heart of one of the world's greatest cities, a silent revolution continued, driven by the power of brotherly love, compassion, and an unwavering determination to do good. Autumn had arrived in New York, painting Central Park in shades of gold and red. Alexander Roth watched the changing landscape from his boardroom window, his mind wandering back to the tumultuous events of the last few months. Roth Industries was in the midst of its biggest transformation in decades. The social housing program was in full swing, with hundreds of families already benefiting. The Roth Foundation had become a respected name in philanthropic circles, leading innovative initiatives in education, health, and sustainability. But with success came challenges. "Mr. Roth?" His assistant's voice brought him back to the present. "The board is ready for the meeting." Alexander nodded, adjusting his tie. "Thank you, Sarah. Tell them I'll be there in a minute." He took one last look at his reflection in the window. The man staring back at him looked older, more tired, but also more alive than he had ever been. With a determined sigh, he headed for the meeting room. The atmosphere was tense when Alexander entered. On one side of the long mahogany table were the more conservative members of the council, led by Richard Blackwell. On the other, Alexander's allies, including Olivia Chen, who flashed him an encouraging smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice firm, "we are here to discuss the future of Roth Industries. The reports you have received clearly show the positive impact of our new initiatives." Richard Blackwell leaned forward, his face a mask of skepticism. "Positive impact?" Alexander. "Our shares fell 15% in the last quarter. Investors are nervous about your unbridled philanthropy." "Unbridled philanthropy?" Olivia intervened, her voice calm but laden with conviction. "Mr. Blackwell, if you look beyond the immediate numbers, you'll see that we're building a solid foundation for the future. Our reputation has improved significantly, opening doors to new markets and partnerships." The discussion intensified, with heated arguments from both sides. Alexander watched, letting each side express their concerns and ideas. Finally, when the debate reached its climax, he raised his hand, silencing the room. "I understand everyone's concerns," he said, his voice calm but firm. "But I ask you to understand this. The world is changing. The companies that will survive and thrive in the future are those that understand their responsibility to society." He paused, looking each board member in the eye. "We're not just doing the right thing. We're positioning Roth Industries to lead the next era of business, an era where profit and purpose go hand in hand." The silence that followed was broken by a solitary round of applause. Everyone turned to see Grace, standing in the doorway of the meeting room, leaning on a cane but with a beaming smile on her face. "Sorry to intrude," she said, entering the room with slow but determined steps, "but I couldn't help listening to my brother's inspiring speech." Grace's presence in the meeting room caused a silent commotion. Many of the board members had not yet personally met Alexander's newfound sister, the woman who had inspired all this change. Alexander hurried to help Grace sit down, concern evident on his face. "You should be resting," he murmured. Grace smiled, squeezing her brother's hand. "And missed the chance to see you in action?" "No way." Turning to the board, Grace continued, "Ladies and gentlemen, I know that many of you have doubts about the new direction of Roth Industries. Believe me, I understand. I've spent years in the corporate world, always balancing the demands of shareholders with the desire to do more for the community." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "But what Alexander is doing here is revolutionary. He's proving that it's possible to be a force for good and still be a successful company." Richard Blackwell, who had been watching Grace with a mixture of curiosity and skepticism, finally spoke up. "Ms. Roth, with all due respect, the business world is not a fairy tale. We have responsibilities to our shareholders." Grace nodded, an understanding smile on her face. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Blackwell, but think about it. Who are our real stakeholders? It's not just the shareholders, but also our employees, the communities where we operate, the planet itself." She leaned forward, her voice gaining strength. "By investing in these areas, we are ensuring not only the company's immediate success, but its longevity and relevance in the future." A murmur ran through the room, with several board members exchanging thoughtful glances. Alexander watched in amazement as his sister, with a few well-placed words, began to change the tone of the meeting. Olivia, seizing the moment, presented a series of graphs and projections. "As you can see, our social initiatives are already generating tangible returns. Our brand is stronger than ever. We're attracting top talent who are looking for companies with purpose, and new markets are opening up to us." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with heated but increasingly constructive discussions. By the end, even the most skeptical board members seemed, if not totally convinced, at least open to giving Alexander's new vision a chance. When the room finally emptied, Alexander dropped into a chair next to Grace, exhausted but relieved. "You were amazing," he said, smiling at his sister. Grace shrugged, but her smile was one of pure pride, just reminding everyone of the power of a little compassion and long-term vision. Olivia joined them, her face beaming with enthusiasm. "That was quite a turnaround. Grace, you should consider officially joining the board." Grace laughed, but there was a thoughtful glint in her eyes. "Who knows? Maybe when I'm 100% recovered." Alexander watched his sister with a mixture of admiration and concern. Despite the good news about her treatment, Grace still had a long way to go. Every public appearance, every meeting like this, took its toll. "Speaking of which," he said gently, "I think it's time we took you back home. It's been enough excitement for one day." Grace nodded, allowing Alexander to help her up. As they headed for the elevator, Olivia followed, her mind already spinning with new ideas and plans. "Alex," she said, "I think we should take advantage of this moment. How about we organize a charity event, something big, to show the world the new face of Roth Industries?" Alexander considered the idea for a moment. It could work. "What do you think, Grace?" Grace smiled, her eyes shining with enthusiasm despite her obvious tiredness. "I think it's a wonderful idea. In fact, I have a few suggestions." As the elevator descended, the three of them excitedly discussed the details of the event. Alexander couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude. Just a few months ago, he was a lonely man at the top of a corporate empire. Now, he was surrounded by people who shared his vision and passion. As they left the building, they were greeted by a light autumn rain. Alexander opened an umbrella, shielding Grace as they walked to their waiting car. "You know," Grace said softly, looking at the fallen leaves on the sidewalk, "when I was out on the streets, I used to look at these huge buildings and wonder if the people inside had any idea of the impact they could have if they just cared a little more." Alexander followed his sister's gaze, seeing the city with new eyes. "What now?" Grace smiled, squeezing her brother's arm. "Now I know that they can. That we can." As the car pulled away, taking the Roth siblings back home, Alexander reflected on the incredible journey he had experienced over the last few months. The challenges were far from over, of course. There was still a lot of work to be done, many minds to be changed, many lives to be impacted. But with Grace by his side, and allies like Olivia to support him, Alexander knew he was on the right track. Roth Industries was no longer just a company. It was a movement, a force for good. And as the city passed by the car window, its lights shining against the darkened sky, Alexander made a silent promise. He would keep fighting, keep pushing the boundaries, keep looking for ways to use his power and resources to make a difference. Because now he understood, true wealth didn't lie in the numbers in a bank account, but in the positive impact you could have on the world. And with this understanding, Alexander Roth was determined to redefine the meaning of success in business, one day at a time. The lights of the Metropolitan Museum of Art shone brightly against the New York night sky. Limousines and luxury cars pulled up in front of the iconic building, disgorging an eclectic mix of guests, CEOs in expensive tuxedos, dazzling celebrities, and, to the surprise of many observers, a diverse group of people who clearly didn't belong to the usual Manhattan gala circuit. Roth Industries' big charity event was in full swing, and it was unlike anything the city had ever seen. Inside the museum, Alexander Roth was nervously adjusting his bow tie, watching the crowd that had gathered in the main lobby. Olivia Chen was at his side, frantically checking her clipboard and giving final orders through her earpiece. "Everything's ready," Olivia finally said, turning to Alexander with a confident smile. "The guests are arriving, the press are positioned, and all our charity partners are in place. Wait, are you ready for this?" Alexander took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "As ready as I can be. Where's Grace?" As if summoned by his words, Grace appeared, walking slowly towards them. She looked stunning in a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her hair, now grown out after the treatment, arranged in a loose bun. She leaned lightly on a stylized cane, but her smile was radiant. "You look beautiful," Alexander said, hugging his sister carefully. Grace smiled, her eyes shining with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "Thanks, big brother. You don't look so bad yourself. Ready to change the world?" Alexander laughed, feeling some of his tension dissipate. "One step at a time, right?" Olivia interrupted them gently. "Sorry, but it's time. Alexander, you need to give your opening speech in 5 minutes." The Roth brothers exchanged a look of mutual understanding before following Olivia towards the makeshift stage in the center of the lobby. Alexander stepped onto the stage, feeling hundreds of eyes turn towards him. He took a deep breath, remembering everything he had been through over the last few months, all the lives that had already started to change thanks to Roth Industries' new initiatives. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice firm and clear. "Welcome to the first, but certainly not the last, Roth Industries' big charity event." He paused, his eyes scanning the diverse crowd. "Looking at this hall tonight, I see something extraordinary. I see business leaders alongside street performers. I see celebrities talking to people who, until recently, didn't have a roof over their heads. I see power and privilege side by side with resilience and hope." The room was absolutely silent, all eyes fixed on Alexander. "A few months ago, I was a very different man," he continued, his voice charged with emotion. "I believed that success was measured only in dollars and cents, but then I met someone who changed everything." His eyes met Grace's in the crowd, and he smiled. "My sister, Grace, showed me a world I barely knew, a world of challenges, yes, but also of incredible human strength and compassion. And it was through her eyes that I finally understood the true purpose of the power and resources I have at my disposal." Alexander paused, letting his words sink in. "Tonight is not just about raising money, although that is important. It's about building bridges, about recognizing that all of us, regardless of our social position or financial situation, have value. We have something to offer, He gestured to the diverse crowd. Look around you, talk to each other, listen to each other's stories, because that's how real change begins, with understanding, with empathy, with the simple willingness to see the other as a human being worthy of respect and opportunity. As Alexander continued his speech, outlining Roth Industries' initiatives and its plans for the future, Grace watched with watery eyes. Seeing her brother there, speaking with such passion and conviction, she could hardly believe the transformation she had witnessed. The rest of the evening passed in a flurry of activity. Alexander and Grace circulated around the hall, introducing CEOs to former homeless people. Facilitating conversations between politicians and community leaders, Olivia coordinated everything masterfully, ensuring that every interaction, every presentation, every demonstration of the Roth Foundation's initiatives had maximum impact. In a quiet corner of the room, Grace found a moment to breathe, observing the scene in front of her. It was then that she noticed an older man approaching, his face vaguely familiar. "Miss Roth," he said, holding out his hand. "Richard Blackwell. We met briefly at the council meeting." Grace smiled, shaking his hand. "Of course, Mr. Blackwell. How are you enjoying the evening?" Richard hesitated for a moment, seeming to choose his words carefully. "To be honest, Ms. Roth, I'm surprised. When your brother proposed this event, I was skeptical. I thought it would be just another public relations exercise." He paused, looking around the room. "But this is different. I see connections being made, ideas being exchanged, inspiring." Grace felt a surge of pride and hope. "I'm glad to hear that, Mr. Blackwell. You know, sometimes all we need is a different perspective to see the possibilities around us." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, of course. And speaking of different perspectives, there's something I'd like to discuss with you and your brother, about the future of Roth Industries." Before Grace could reply, they were interrupted by a commotion nearby. Alexander was in the center of a group of journalists, all asking questions at the same time. "Mr. Roth, is it true that Roth Industries is considering donating 50% of its profits to social causes?" "Alexander, there are rumors that you plan to step down as CEO to devote yourself entirely to philanthropy. Can you comment?" Alexander raised his hands, asking for silence. His gaze met Grace's, and she could see the mixture of determination and uncertainty in his eyes. This was a crucial moment, and they both knew it. Grace stepped forward, placing herself next to her brother. Together they faced the cameras and microphones, ready to shape the future of Roth Industries and perhaps New York with their words. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice firm, "Roth Industries is indeed entering a new era, an era in which business success and positive social impact are not only compatible, but inseparable." He paused, exchanging a glance with Grace before continuing. "As for the specific details of our future initiatives, my sister and I would like to make an official announcement." A murmur of anticipation ran through the crowd. Grace felt the weight of the moment, but also a sense of certainty she hadn't experienced for a long time. "As of today," Grace said, her voice clear and confident, "Roth Industries is committed to dedicating not 50%, but 60% of its annual profits to social and environmental initiatives." There was an explosion of camera flashes and surprised exclamations. Alexander continued, "In addition, we are restructuring our leadership. I will remain CEO, but with a renewed focus on integrating business and social impact. And I'm pleased to announce that my sister, Grace Roth, will take on the position of Director of Social Impact, overseeing all of our philanthropic initiatives." The room exploded with questions and comments, but the Roth siblings remained calm, united in their purpose. As they answered journalists' questions, detailing their plans and vision for the future, Grace couldn't help but reflect on the incredible journey that had brought them there. From a chance meeting on the streets of New York to a corporate revolution that could change the face of philanthropy and business forever. The event continued well into the night, with pledges exceeding all expectations, partnerships being formed between the most unlikely sectors, and a palpable sense of possibility permeating the air. When they finally managed a moment of quiet, Alexander and Grace found themselves on a small balcony overlooking the city that never sleeps. "We did it," Alexander said softly, hugging his sister. Grace smiled, looking out at the lights of New York. "No, Alex, we're just getting started." And as the Roth siblings watched the city below, they both knew that tonight was just the beginning of something truly extraordinary. A new era not only for Roth Industries, but for the very concept of how business could be a force for good in the world. The challenge ahead was immense, but together, with their shared vision, their unwavering determination and the power of their combined stories, they were ready to take it on, one day at a time. The sun was rising over New York, its first golden lights reflecting in the windows of the skyscrapers. On the rooftop of the Roth Industries building, Alexander and Grace Roth watched the spectacle in silence, their hands intertwined in a gesture of mutual support. A year had passed since the great charity event that had marked the beginning of a new era for the company and the Roth siblings, a year of challenges, triumphs, and above all, profound transformation. "It seems like yesterday we met on that sidewalk," Grace said softly, breaking the silence. Alexander smiled, gently squeezing his sister's hand. "And look at us now." The year following the charity event had been a roller coaster of emotions and achievements. The decision to dedicate 60% of Roth Industries' profits to social causes had sent shockwaves through the corporate world. There were critics, of course, who proclaimed that it was the end of the company. But to the surprise of many, and to the delight of Alexander and Grace, Roth Industries not only survived but thrived. Under Alexander's visionary leadership and Grace's compassionate guidance as Director of Social Impact, the company has become a model for ethical and sustainable business. New partnerships were forged. Innovations emerged from collaboration with previously marginalized communities, and a culture of purpose and engagement flourished among employees. But the road had not been easy. "Remember that first shareholder meeting after the announcement?" Alexander asked, a wry smile playing on his lips. Grace laughed softly. "How could I forget? I thought Richard Blackwell was going to have a heart attack right there." The memory of that tense meeting was still vivid in their minds. Furious shareholders demanding explanations, threats of lawsuits, gloomy predictions of imminent bankruptcy. But Alexander and Grace had stood firm, defending their vision with a mixture of solid data and passionate appeals to conscience. It was at that critical moment that Richard Blackwell, to everyone's surprise, had stood up to defend the Roth brothers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he had said, his voice thundering through the room, "I spent decades in this industry believing that a company's only duty was to maximize shareholder profits. But these young people have shown me a truth I can no longer ignore. The true value of a company lies in the positive impact it can have on the world." Blackwell's unexpected support had been a turning point. Gradually, more and more shareholders began to see the value of Roth Industries' new direction, not only in terms of social impact, but also as a long-term business strategy. "Speaking of Richard," Grace said, snapping back to the present, "I hear he's considering joining the foundation's board." Alexander nodded, a genuine smile lighting up his face. "What do you know? Our staunchest critic becoming one of our greatest allies." The sun was now fully above the horizon, bathing the city in a golden light. The Roth brothers watched New York awaken, reflective. "Do you know what I'm most proud of?" Grace asked, her voice soft but full of emotion. Alexander turned to her, curious. "What?" "The fact that we're not alone on this journey," she replied. "Look at how many other companies have followed our example in the last year. The movement we started is growing." It was true. The Roth Industries model had inspired a wave of change in the corporate world. Other companies, large and small, were starting to rethink their priorities, looking for ways to integrate social impact into their business models. "And to think it all started with you pretending to be homeless for a day," Grace teased, poking her brother playfully. Alexander laughed, but his eyes were serious when they met Grace's. "It started with you, Grace, your strength, your compassion. You changed my life. And through me, you changed the lives of so many others." Grace felt tears forming in her eyes, but she brushed them away with a smile. "We're a good team, aren't we?" "The best," Alexander agreed, hugging her. At that moment, they were interrupted by the sound of a door opening. Olivia Chen entered the terrace, a beaming smile on her face and a stack of papers in her hands. "Sorry to interrupt the sisterly moment," she said, joining them, "but I thought you might like to see this. The figures for the last quarter have just arrived." Alexander and Grace leaned over to examine the documents, their eyes widening as they absorbed the information. This is real?" Alexander asked in disbelief. Olivia nodded, her smile widening. "Very real. Our revenues are up 25% on last year, and most importantly, our measurable social impact has grown by over 200%. Grace let out a laugh of pure joy, hugging Olivia impulsively. "That's incredible. All those lives impacted, all those stories changed." Alexander was silent for a moment, letting the weight of those realizations sink in. When he finally spoke, his voice was charged with emotion. "You know, when I started this journey, I thought I was sacrificing business success for social good. But now I see that I was wrong. It's not a trade-off. It's a synergy. The more good we do, the more we prosper." Olivia nodded, her eyes shining with determination. "And that's just the beginning. I have some ideas for expanding our impact even further next year." As Olivia outlined her plans, Alexander and Grace exchanged a look of mutual understanding. They had come a long way, but the journey was far from over. The rest of the morning was spent in a series of meetings and conference calls. Roth Industries was more active than ever, with projects underway ranging from affordable housing to technology education in underprivileged communities. At the end of the day, Alexander found Grace in his office, organizing the last details of a new mental health initiative for homeless people. "Hey, little sister," he said, knocking lightly on the open door. "Ready to go?" Grace looked up, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "Almost. I just need to finish up here." Alexander walked in, taking a seat in the chair opposite Grace's desk. For a moment, he just watched his sister work, amazed at her dedication and tireless energy. "You know," he finally said, "sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't decided to disguise myself as a homeless person that day." Grace stopped what she was doing, meeting her brother's gaze. "I believe the universe has a way of bringing together people who are meant to meet, Kaz Alex. If it wasn't that day, it would have been another." Alexander smiled, nodding in agreement. "Maybe you're right, but I'm glad it happened that way. Even with all the misunderstandings and initial difficulties?" Grace laughed, remembering the tense moments when the truth came out. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" "And it's not over yet," Alexander replied, standing up and holding out his hand to his sister. "Shall we? We have an important appointment, remember?" Grace nodded, picking up her bag and following Alexander out of the office. Together, they walked down to the first floor, where a car was waiting for them. 20 minutes later, they arrived at their destination, a new community center in the heart of one of New York's most deprived neighborhoods. The building, once abandoned and deteriorating, now shone with a new facade and a large sign that read, "Roth Community Center, a place to grow and dream." Dozens of people were already gathered outside, waiting for the opening ceremony. There were local families, volunteers, Roth Industries employees, and, to Grace's surprise and delight, many familiar faces from the streets she used to frequent. When Alexander and Grace got out of the car, they were greeted with warm applause, hands outstretched to greet them, voices thanking them for what they had done for the community. Grace felt tears of joy forming in her eyes as she walked towards the podium, Alexander by her side. This moment, this tangible realization of their shared dreams, was more than she had ever dared to hope for. Alexander gently squeezed Grace's hand before stepping aside to let her give the opening speech. Grace took a deep breath, looking out at the expectant crowd. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began, her voice clear and firm. "Just over a year ago, I was on the streets, with no idea where my life was going. Today, I stand here before you, inaugurating a center that I hope will be a beacon of hope and opportunity for this community." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "This center is not just a building. It's a promise that no one has to face their challenges alone. A promise that every person, regardless of their circumstances, deserves a chance to grow, to learn, and to dream. As Grace continued her speech, detailing the programs and services the center would offer, Alexander watched with pride. His sister had become an inspiring leader, a voice for those who often go unheard. When the speech was over and the tape was cut, the Roth siblings walked side by side through the new center, talking to people, listening to their stories and hopes for the future. At the end of the day, exhausted but deeply satisfied, Alexander and Grace met again on the terrace of Roth Industries, watching the sun set over the city. "So," Alexander said, a smile playing on his lips, "what do you think? Did we manage to change the world?" Grace laughed, resting her head on her brother's shoulder. "Maybe not the whole world. Not yet, but we've certainly changed a few worlds today, and tomorrow we'll change a few more." Alexander nodded, his expression turning serious. "You know, Grace, I used to think I had it all. Money, power, success, but it wasn't until I met you that I realized how empty my life was." Grace raised her head, looking into her brother's eyes. "And me, I thought I'd lost everything. But in fact, I was about to gain something I never knew I needed. A brother, a family, a greater purpose." The brothers were silent for a moment, reflecting on the incredible journey they had shared. From a chance encounter on the streets of New York to a revolution in business and philanthropy, their story was a testament to the power of compassion, family, and unwavering determination. "So, what's next?" Alexander finally asked. Grace smiled, her eyes shining with the promise of new challenges and possibilities. Now we go on. We keep learning, growing, making an impact, one day at a time, one life at a time." Alexander nodded, a smile spreading across his face. "Together! Together!" Grace confirmed, squeezing her brother's hand. And as the sun set over New York, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the Roth siblings stood side by side, united not only by blood, but by a shared vision of a better world. A world where the power of business could be used to uplift, to heal, to transform. Their journey was far from over. In fact, in many ways, it had only just begun. But with the strength of their brotherly bond, the hard-won wisdom of their experiences, and the support of a dedicated team and a grateful community, Alexander and Grace Roth were ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. Because they now understood a fundamental truth: true success, true wealth, is not measured in dollars and cents, but in the positive impact you have on the lives of others. And to that extent, the Roth brothers were already immensely wealthy, with the promise of an even greater fortune to come.